Hello, I'm Paul Gates. Welcome to AppTV's The Academics. Nancy Love can't join us today, so it's just me and our two panelists, Dr. Michael Wade of the History Department and Dr. Dave Spiceland of the Communication Department. Welcome to both of you. Today we'll be discussing the rhetoric of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and take a look at what voters should think about when they enter the polls in November. Let's start with the health care debate over what Bill Clinton said in Flint, Michigan the other day. He covered a lot of ground in about a 40-minute speech, but what's been seized on by the media is that he called the Obamacare, the health care plan, crazy. Is that true? Let's have some thoughts about that.
I'm not a big fan of, and some who are supportive of the health care plan say it's not Obamacare, it's the Affordable Care Act. But the problem is there are so many more elements to the ACA than what we give credit for. For instance, menus outside restaurants have to have calorie information because of the Affordable Care Act, which nobody talks about. Is it crazy? Depends on how you feel about government regulation.
Is that what he was talking about, is that kind of thing, or is he just talking about the coverage plans? Mike?
Well, I find it interesting that first the media has treated it the way it has. I mean, the reactions to from the opposition was immediate and fairly predictable. You see, this is a plan that's been flawed all along. What Clinton said was that President Obama was what President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and quite a few other people have been saying, that problems have emerged with the plan that need attention. And it's no surprise. The chief problem is that the health care participants are still being hit by rising costs, which means that the program, the only version which Congress would approve, is still subject to the pricing mechanisms of corporate hospitals and physician care on the one hand, and the financial indecencies that are visited on them by the pharmaceuticals industry. That's the part that Congress did not want to touch.
And of course, the main feature of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is that there are 20 million people covered by health insurance who were not covered before.
Right.
And the problem that bill actually was referring to was the fact that for some people who are really working hard don't get coverage because they don't qualify for the subsidies. So even though they're working and maybe even had insurance before, they don't qualify for subsidies and they have to pay more out of pocket for their insurance.
Right.
So that's his problem really with this. And that's what he was saying, but it's not being reported that way.
Well, and the architects of Obamacare in the interviews, they were blaming the Republicans for a lot of the problems. But there was not a single Republican who voted for the Health Care Act, so many years ago, which the Democrats say, well, if they had been part of the process that, but they had the majority, the Democrats did. And there were some suggestions on the part of the Republicans that were just ignored that might have, and is anything ever going to fix health care? Probably not. I mean, this is one of those, dark holes that we go down, that we blame everybody, and does anything ever get done?
I think Dave's right. Republicans didn't vote for it. I don't know whether their suggestions would have improved it or not. But it was the flaws in the program are largely flaws that should be laid at the feet of Congress. President Obama, perhaps he shouldn't have done it, took the only health care bill he could get out of that Congress. I think that Hillary Clinton should probably double down on her husband's comments and call on the voters to elect a Congress next month, both parties, willing to act in the public interest, because leaving consumers to the tender mercies of big pharma and HMOs and the other people who have fastened themselves onto the process that should be real health care is the problem. And it will not get solved by any president who doesn't have a different Congress.
Well, and to bring back to that thing about when the infamous quote about we have to pass the bill to see what's in the bill, which is a lot of the problem how Congress acts, because a lot of people who are voting for things let their staff look at it. The congressman from Detroit, he said, I don't have time to read this bill. Well, that's what we pay you for, so it'd be nice if you at least tried. And that's, it's not a Democrat thing, it's Republican and Democrats both.
Yep. You know, one final thought. Self-styled conservatives like to remind us that no one owes any American a living. If they believe that to be true for the working poor and the disadvantaged, wouldn't it be entirely logical to apply the same dictum to corporations who are rich? Tell big pharmaceuticals, HMOs, and the health insurance oligopoly that they especially are not owed a living at the public's expense.
And you're referring there, Mike, of course, to the fact that nothing's going to change until costs are reined in.
That's it. They represent overhead, and it's much of it is not necessary overhead.
And a typical conservative view would be, let's let competition, which is not always the answer, but like the EpiPen business. One of the reasons that the price jumped so much has been cited that there's only one company that's making the EpiPen. And if you allowed competition, because congressional mandate said only one company will do it, let competition get in there and maybe the price, hopefully the price would be lower.
Sure. And then EpiPen's only the most recent example of
and I rely on that EpiPen, so.
Well, okay. Well, before we leave the topic, let's look at what, I've got here what Clinton really said in that speech, when he referred to the craziness. So you've got this crazy system where all of a sudden 25 million or more people have health care, and then the people who are out there busting it, sometimes 60 hours a week, wind up with their premiums doubled and their coverage cut in half. It's the craziest thing in the world. So that's what he really said, and the media has seized on the crazy part of it, and
Instead of why is that so?
Instead of how it got crazy.
Well, and back to the promise, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor that President Obama promised. If you like your health care, you can keep your health care, which he promised, which was not true. You can call it a lie if you want to. In fact, some evidence indicates he knew it was not true. It'd be nice if they would tell the truth.
Well, that would be certainly the ideal. Let's get to the election now, since we're around 30 days away. And closing fast with a debate, second debate on Sunday. Let's look at what Hillary and Donald are the way they're approaching their rhetoric. This divisive, very different approaches to reaching the voters. It turns out to be rather divisive.
I'm shocked, totally shocked, that candidates would attack other candidates. And I hear people say, well, why can't they say good things about each other or whatever? It's almost like the War of the Roses, years ago in Tennessee. Two brothers were, running for, I think, for governor of Tennessee. And attack ads work. The attacks work. The question is, are they accurate? And do we elect the best people in the process?
Why do attack ads work?
Why when we walk through the supermarket and we see the National Enquirer with all the negative information and stars without makeup, and everybody talks about how horrible that is, and they still buy it? That's what keeps them in business.
But what is it about that approach that is attractive to some voters? I mean, it works, appeals to fear and emotion.
Human nature?
And 6 decades of dumbing down by television. and other media forms. You know, the new cell phones and tweeting are no help whatever. I wonder if people who do that ever calculate how much time per week they spend doing it. I suspect it's substantial, and it's essentially mindless.
And there's balanced congruity models that say that we gravitate to that which we agree with. So we tend to watch Fox News, which, by the way, is not all conservative. We watch MSNBC, which is not all liberal, and Lord knows where CNN is, somewhere in the middle. And we're trying to find that which we can agree with or can has some congruity to our belief system.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. I think maybe last week we mentioned selective exposure.
And I wasn't there last week.
And confirmation bias
Yeah.
and that kind of thing.
You know what strikes me about this, the divisive rhetoric is this, and it really goes to Hillary Clinton. Both candidates' negatives are high enough where there's probably not much upside in spending a whole bunch of money trying to drive them further up. And I think particularly in the case of you know, the Donald's grade school nastiness, that speaks for itself. His negatives are in good hands when they're in his hands. Hillary Clinton should probably, and so should Trump for that matter, but Clinton should probably be spending more of her money on campaign ads and speeches that offer Americans a program to domestically secure this country to cope with a world that is rapidly destabilizing. She's got parts of it, but she doesn't have the whole.
But would that not require nuance and some explanation and so forth, whereas divisive emotional comment is very easy to digest in very small bites and really is quite effective, apparently.
Like the basket of deplorables, that
Well,
line of...
that kind of thing. I mean, those kind of labels that take, you know, 4 or 5 seconds to, you know, to say the sentence that
And that's the sound
contains.
bite. That's what happens.
Right.
That's what our news
Yeah.
is geared to do, is the sound bite.
And of course, television, you'd be acquainted with this, Dave, is that can be edited, and context is often lost in broadcasting.
We hope for more from the voters, including ourselves, I think. We should demand more from the candidates. And would it require more for Clinton to do that, to explain things? Yeah, but it's a teachable moment. And that's what this campaign should be about. Focusing on each other's negatives is no service to anybody.
Well, who are we trying to reach with this explanation that you talk about, Mike?
You know, I think just to have a little faith in the voting public and try to lay it out as plainly as possible, knowing that there are people who are going to disagree no matter how well laid out it is, and bet that the majority of people will respond to it.
And I remember, I'm 60-some years old. I remember back in the 60s, early 60s, my next door neighbor talking to my parents, complaining about going to the polls to vote and having to hold your nose. So I wonder if this has always been a problem, or is it more of a problem? And when you think about the elections, think about the 1800 election, which I was not there. My students think I was there. But you've got, you know, Thomas Jefferson and Adams, and you've got that nastiness about Sally Hemings and whatever. We've always had elections that have just been, Andrew Jackson, he almost got into a duel with his opponent.
Well, we've heard that the two sides are kind of hardened in their positions, more than perhaps usual. Is this explanation going to work on the middle, the undecided middle, Mike?
What positions?
Well, that if Hillary would explain them.
Oh, if she would, okay.
That you were talking about.
I don't, you know, I think Hillary's campaign is somewhat better than Trump's in terms of positions. I mean, we've heard about solar energy. We've heard about a tax program. But there's no overall vision. I mean, we're talking about where the country is headed in a very troubling century. When are we going to have some serious talk from serious people?
Any hope for that?
I don't think so.
In this election?
Between now and November?
Between now and November?
I wouldn't lay money on it.
Dave?
Ditto. But again, when you look at media coverage, in fact, I have, I don't know why, but I have this little thing of recording, and I happen to record. I don't do it systematically unless I know something's coming up, but I have recorded a lot of the presidential, the gubernatorial spots, and I'm impressed, or lacked of impressed. Trump has not done much in the way of, because that's where the election really happens, is on TV, possibly radio. But Hillary is driving up Trump's negatives with the comments that he's made stupidly in the past. But I keep thinking, okay, tell me something about what you would do in your spots. And I don't hear much of that. And you know, there's this generic kind of thing that the candidates have always tended to do that. You know, then after the election, it's, in fact, let me raise one more thing. It would be nice if we found out who's going to be your chief of staff, who are going to have maybe even some Supreme Court nominees. I think Trump's mentioned one person. I mean, that's the power of the presidency, not just once you're elected. If you ever saw the movie The Candidate with Robert Redford, and you know, he goes from an idealist maybe to the left, and then he comes to the center to get the votes. And at the very end of the movie, I'm giving this away, at the end of the movie, he sits down on the bed and he looks at his the fella helping him with the campaign, and he says, now what? Once he's elected. And I think a lot of candidates do that when they're elected. Okay, what do we do now?
That's a pretty good introduction to our last part, Dave.
Okay.
What should the voters be focusing on? What should they be thinking about when they get into the polling place? What, rather than these negatives and those kinds of things that we are hearing a lot about and that you don't seem to think there's much hope of changing, well, what should they really be looking at?
5-cent Cokes. They're longing, many of the voters are longing for a country that existed in the 50s and 60s. That to me is you know, what taking the country back is about, a nostalgia for the good old days. That was a time that was without parallel in previous history and is never going to come again. It was a particular era, and it wasn't as good as you know, as people I think like to imagine. Well, but obviously, taking the country back, well, who has it for openers? It's not who most of Trump's supporters think. Liberals don't control the country. They're the biggest straw man in American political history. Corporations basically have the balance of power in this country. And all it takes really is looking at what's going on, and if you really want some evidence, there's a 2014 Princeton study that pretty well says it. Look at ecological reality. You know, the evidence is out there. And think about, you know, they should think about, we should all think about our children and grandchildren and their inheritance. What are we leaving them? It doesn't look good.
A big debt. We've got a big debt out there, trillions of dollars through the Obama presidency.
Is that one of the issues that
I think that's
ought to
a
be
big
talked
issue.
about? What else, Dave? What else should we be talking about?
Most people, when they hear about the debt, it doesn't mean anything. It's so abstract in terms of how much money I owe. I think personally, I think it's a good issue. Taxation's a good issue, but it's difficult to get your arm around it. Now, in terms of getting into the booth or whatever, I think that there's, on both sides, and I'm not including libertarian candidates, which we could, there's the Kool-Aid drinkers on both sides. There's the people who, it doesn't matter if Hillary Clinton, and I'm not saying this, but if Hillary Clinton were to say, I am a bona fide witch, and if Donald Trump were to say, I am a warlock, And I believe, and really wacky, they'd say, I'm still going to vote for him because my daddy voted for Republican and I'm going to vote, and vice versa. But it's the great middle, the undecided or whatever, that we're shooting for.
So, but the abstract doesn't work, is what you're
I think it
started off with
should,
there.
but I don't think the abstract has that much power on the electorate.
Well, what should be taken out of the abstract and addressed concretely and straightforwardly? And we just got a couple of minutes here.
Taxation.
Okay, taxation.
When I hear President Obama tell me your tax, if you make more than $250,000 or less than that, your taxes are not going to increase. And then they did. And I can see how my taxes have gone up. I'd like to see less taxes.
Other issues, Dave?
The inheritance. Do we want to leave them a revived representative government that operates in reasoned and reasonable national interest to recover the country from this corporate oligarchy that is currently has its tentacles all through the government? Do we want to leave them a livable planet with political and social stability, or a depleted shell consumed by plagues and wars and, frankly, barbarism? This is probably the most important election in American history.
Yeah.
Time is short. We need a sensible program for a sensible future, and it's nowhere in sight.
If I had my druthers, if I had the power to change the Constitution, I would have term limits for Congress. This business of being in there for 50, 60 years, I don't care who you are, Republican, Democrat, that has got to end. Because if we have more invigoration in the congressional system, now this is idealistic. Is it ever going to happen? I don't think so, because any constitutional amendment has to start in Congress. Now the other thing is, a lot of conservatives have talked about, well, we need to have another constitutional convention. And I mean, that's a problem, because all these folks who love the Second Amendment, which I'm in favor of the Second Amendment, that might get taken out. Who knows what a constitutional convention would do?
We've done that once, and everything is at risk. Everything
Yeah.
is on the table if you go that route. Well, that's our time, I think.
Are we done already?
We are
Wow.
almost. And Mike, any closing thoughts? Dave, anything in our last couple of seconds here?
Vote, but vote knowing the issues.
Mike?
Yeah.
Vote knowing the issues, and hold your nose or not. Not voting is also a choice, and one not to be taken.
Okay, that's our time this week. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on The Academics.
And remember those.